IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Rohan Seth and I am here today with Prateek, Waghre and Sapni. In this podcast, we talk a lot about a range of tech. But today, we are going to go back to the basics and look at digital communication networks. Prateek and Sapni, of course, have written an excellent paper on it. It talks about DCNs interaction with markets, with society, and it has some brilliant conclusions. Takshila offers great research, and I hope that you, dear reader, finds time to read it. But also, if you are interested in the kind of stuff that we talk about on this podcast, do try and check out our courses. We'll put the link in the show notes below. And in those courses, both Prateek and Sapni are involved, and we talk about a range of issues in tech. Right. Having said that, Prateek, Sapni, welcome to All Things Policy. We are here to talk about your paper on DCNs. So, Prateek, why don't you take some time to tell us about what DCNs are, because it's a bit of an unusual definition.
Yeah, thanks, Aronya. I think it makes sense just to recap what that term is and how we define it, right? So, essentially, abbreviated DCNs, but what we call digital communication networks. As a tool, you can think of them as broadly your social media platforms plus your close messaging app, and giving us some room for future proofing as and when more use cases come along. But we've defined it as, a composite entity consisting of three things, right? The first being capability. So that's essentially your internet-based products or services that enable instantaneous communication at either low cost or free, right? Across a range of geographical, social, and cultural boundaries, right? Not just communication. It can be one-to-one. It can be one-to-N, right? It can be many to many, and composing of all sorts of things like your various Twitter feeds, your live videos, etc. Right? So a whole range of different types of use cases. The second part is our operators, and these are essentially, think of them as firms or groups, right, that design and operate these services, right, which then provide these capabilities. And the last part, or the third part, is our networks, right? Networks are essentially the various entities, groups, and individuals that use these products and services to communicate, or to communicate and interact. But also important to remember that when we say networks here, we're not referring to just networks on one particular product or service. We're speaking of them across, right, a whole range of different sets of products and services and how they interact. And the purpose of this framing is, right, we're trying to draw focus on looking at them from the perspective of their, the effect that they have on societies as a whole, rather than just focusing on maybe a specific set of companies, a specific technologies, or a subset of harms that they cause, or specific sharing mechanisms, or very specific user bases and that sort of thing. Right? So we're trying to get, the idea is to take a step back and look at the broader picture. And that's what that was the idea with this framing, right, of digital communication network, or a DCM, that we'll refer to them for the rest of the episode.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting definition you went with, Prateek, because it does so much work in cutting across contexts and different kinds of social networks, whether or not they're based on interest graphs or social graphs and so on. But tell me a little like this, what I generally hear when people are talking about social media and social networks, and in this case, DCNs, is that it basically techlash stuff, right? Literature that talks about how terrible they are. But here you're talking about the benefits. So elaborate a little more on that.
Yeah, so this, in many ways, this is a very interesting paper to write. And the reason we're looking at benefit, now there are multiple levels or layers to this, right? One is from a purely procedural perspective, right? Given that our long-term aim is to understand how India should govern digital communication networks and the various effects they have on society, right? We need to be able to articulate both the harms as well as the benefits. Right now, back in July, we had done this paper, on where we enumerated harms and we categorized them as whether they were functions of market failure, social problems, or cognitive bias. And even in that paper, I think we stated that a future line of work for us was going to be to try and understand, or try and enhance our understanding of benefits. And during a lot of various internal discussions, plus looking at general conversations in the news, in the public space right now, it became clear to us that the benefits are not always, or not as self-evident as we might think, right? And certainly not to everyone. And then when we went back and tried to find literature around this, we noticed that, and I'm doing I'm painting some of it with a little bit of with broad brushstrokes, but bear with me for a second. We found that a lot of it hadn't really evolved from what was being said in the late 2000s, early 2010, right? Just post Arab Spring about it being democratizing force and enabling media literacy and civic participation and things like that. Or there was research in very specific context, as in what's happening in education, what's happening in healthcare, what's happening with government officials, etc. Right? But this was interesting because, in contrast, right, over the last 5-6 years, there's been a lot of documentation of the harm, right, and we've seen a lot of effort towards that end. And of course, while we were writing this paper, we also had that the whole thing about the Facebook papers, Facebook files, Facebook documents, right? Whatever we want to call them. Now we've already done an episode of that, so I won't. There's no point going off many of the same points. But one thing we did mention was that many of these revelations were not necessarily new to folks who've been following the space pretty closely, right? But at the same time, it did spotlight the harm conversation to a lot more people, right? It brought a much larger focus onto that. And now imagine this in a world or an environment where already we have countries, geo blocks around the world that want to regulate the DCN firms and networks, right? And while they absolutely must be held to account for the various corporate governance failures that we've seen over the last couple of years that we've seen come out, and especially what the Facebook papers also highlighted. Our societal level responses should not be knee-jerk, and they shouldn't be ones that ultimately take away control from or take away power from civil society and citizens, and then push that away from us. So because it's important for us to understand that why it gets so challenging, right? That the same changes to the scale and structure of human networks, the speed of information flows, the fact that information that we come across is algorithmically selected. Now, while this plays a role in enabling harms, the same mechanisms also have a role in mitigating some of the harms or enabling benefits. Right now, like for example, there's very little chance an Indian citizen who was caught in a precarious situation in some country would be able to get an external affairs minister to respond, right? Or the way we saw very dedicated, motivated people coming together to coordinate and organize resources during the second day of COVID-19 in India, right? These same dynamics played a role there. But again, at the same time, I think we need to be watchful for certain things also, that while stating benefits and opportunities, and whatever else, it's important that we don't completely absolve DCN firms of their responsibility in whatever that is in perpetuating the harms, nor should we be giving them more credit than they due. Right. And that's why what we've tried to do predominantly is that we focused more on the capabilities and the networks aspect of the DCN definition. Having said that, it's not completely possible to ignore the firms themselves, right? But that's how we went about approaching this paper and thinking about why we should be talking about benefits and how we should do that.
Sapni?
I think, again, building on what Prateek has mentioned, the idea that we have been empowered by DCNs is something that at this point many of us take for granted. And the benefits then and the intricacies of the benefits that act on very different spheres of life, that is something that has gotten very, very little attention. And that is what the objective of this particular paper has been. And while doing that, we've clearly laid down that in the previous paper, of course, and even within this paper, we've pointed out the troubles that we have not, when we're least interested in absolving any sort of liability that has to fall on these DCNs. So to find that right balance when it comes to regulation, as Prateek has mentioned, that there are long-term goal is to see how India can regulate these DCNs. So if that is the ultimate objective, it has to be seen that the intricacies of benefits are also observed with as much as possible, with as much detail as we delve into the harms that they have created. And then, of course, it's not ignorable, definitely not. So that's the sort of approach we've taken. And I think it is in the longer run, particularly from the Indian perspective, we probably don't see as much attention given to the benefits from a literature point of view, at least as we looked into the sphere of studies around DCNs in India. So I think this is a good contribution there. And while we continue doing that, we'll also look at the other aspects which can contribute to regulation from multiple perspectives and sort of strike that balance.
Right, great, thanks. I want to get into stuff about economic opportunities, economic efficiencies, the intersection of DCNs and the markets and so on. Because I think it's a great paper to read and a lot of insight that comes from it. But before we do that, let's take a quick commercial break.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. Do you think coffee is a good pre-workout drink? Hear what Arman Sood, co-founder of Sleepy Owl Coffee, has to say about it, only on Raw and Organic with Kunal Rajput. We are back with a new capsule series on the Feeding 10 Billion podcast. In this 6-episode series, host Varun Deshpande speaks to famed personalities about the future of smart protein. Tune in to hear what Indra Nui, Ritesh and Janelia Deshmukh and other amazing guests have to say. On Tere Mere Raaste, Keshav recounts an adventure. Hear how he traveled more than 1,100 kilometers from Lucknow to New Jalpaiguri in merely 21 hours. I can't believe anybody did that in India. Definitely will listen to that story. On Hans Vani, hear the story of Matsyagandha. Discover how lovers Batahu and Sursati are torn apart by fate. On Smarter with Sid learns 3 ways to pitch a new idea to reluctant team members. And on Paisa Vaisa, Amit Gainda, CEO, Avance Financial Limited, talks to Anupam about educational loans. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Go check out our YouTube channels. We go live on a whole bunch of different things. We have a number of different channels. You can find them on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, CoinSwitch Kuber, Intel, and Oxfam India. Thank you for making this possible.
Hi, welcome back to All Things Policy. I've got Prateek and Sapni with me here, and I'd like to talk about the market fit of the paper that you've written, because I think it's quite sort of underappreciated, if that's the correct term. Maybe I'm not fitting my words right, but the role that DCNs play, the intersection that they have with the markets. So, Sapni, tell us a little more about that.
So at the intersection of DCNs and markets, we've broadly looked at the economic opportunities that DCNs have created and the economic efficiencies that have been facilitated by DCNs. So on the economic opportunities front, it is very interesting to see that DCNs essentially enable the creation of whole new ecosystems generating economic activities. There are highly niche areas of economic activity which were previously more or less non-existent. So they have helped in creating that. So an example would be the creator economy. The creator economy, a creator in a pre-DCN sense, is probably an artist of some sort, in the broadest, widest definition that the word artist can have. But the ability and the set of tools that creator economy, which is more or less held by DCNs, has given people to look at it as a viable alternative opportunity is great. I mean, in the Indian influencer marketing industry itself, we look at, which is one part of the creator economy. It's expected somewhere around 70 to 150 million USD, according to some. So that is a great opening of new ecosystem that has happened. And the creator economy itself that further creates multiple other benefits which are of economic nature, like it's offering direct support, these DCNs offering direct support, then it feeds into traditional media. Debatable if, we increase the quality of traditional media or decrease, but definitely it does provide that sort of inflow of newer talent and newer content. Another interesting category of economic opportunity is how new categories of jobs have been created by DCNs. So previously, graphic designing or video editing, that's something that was very niche, that was limited to the kinds of probably your ad industry or print and display ad industry, which was not part of the broader picture as much as it is today. So that has been fueled a lot by DCNs and jobs like social media managers, community coordinators, content curators, and then the fueling of UX design and virtual assistants. These are things that barely existed, but a lot of it goes to the credit of internet itself. The boom of the internet culture happened a lot. That can be credited to DCNs as well. We also looked at leveraging network opportunities, as you were mentioning, so Rohan, rightly, the idea of social graph, etc., which we'll definitely come to later in greater detail. But those sorts of networks, to leverage those networks for job opportunities. So in the US, I think we saw that sometime during the 2008 recession. And in India, we saw that quite a bit during the pandemic, where connections on DCN, so whether it be your followers or the people you follow on Twitter, on Instagram, etc., those connections that could be leveraged for work, whether it could be full-time work or it has helped a lot of people who do freelance work as well. And we also look broadly, in addition to this new ecosystem certification, we also look at the benefits for Indian businesses. So that includes a push that Indian businesses got for cross-border growth, and how advertisement, the entire advertisement industry itself has become more amenable to the not so big players. So, and then targeted advertisements, definitely they have benefited these smaller sort of businesses, where now a lot of cross country level trade happens, and it has obviously benefited even the bigger players. So an example I think we use is how the range which the Sabyasachi's of our day have, and how that is fueled a lot by Instagram, and how his Instagram benefits greatly. And that doesn't benefit just that brand, it also trickles down to the artisans who are involved with it. And another very interesting case study is how thrifting as an activity, it was pretty shunned in India, that, we do not use clothes that were used by somebody else. But DCNs have essentially created that entire ecosystem where this is seen as a cool thing today. And those sort of opportunities, breaking into that market, which was completely non-existent, it is heavily supported by DCNs. And coming back to the advertising point, I think the reach that smaller businesses themselves have, the opportunities for sustenance in the form of newer revenue sources, in addition to the mere access to more targeted advertisement, is pretty underappreciated. So when it comes to many DCNs that operate on advertisement supported business models, they do provide access to their services in return for users, tracking users' activities. Obviously, the privacy question is there, and we cannot ignore that. That's definitely a thorn there, right? But the business model does enable trade-off for access to spaces that would otherwise be inaccessible. And this has also contributed to the creation of other, mimicking other forms of revenue generation, such as subscriptions and fees, etc., which would have been earlier difficult for smaller establishments. So that's broadly how we have looked at economic opportunities that have been created. And while we move on to the economic efficiencies, we broadly divided it into, one is the fact that there is greater access to information, and that in itself creates an economic efficiency, in the sense that, there is more information to more people, which aids further information generation and consumption in an information economy that we are in today. So they have really contributed to reduction in transaction costs. And this essentially proves why DCNs have created economic efficiencies through such greater access to information. And finally, we look at online social graphs. So as you were mentioning earlier, so the social graph, the idea of a social graph, which the term itself, which comes from that one speech which Zuckerberg made almost a decade plus back. So that idea, how to leverage that social graph, the creation of this particular tool that has been identified and made easy to access by DCNs, that characterization itself, they have entrenched this online social graph as an essential feature, and they enable social trapezoid. So it's basically how, while it helps a DCN itself, that tool itself, that characteristic of social graph itself is very useful for others who are on the DCN. So that has benefited the sharing economy businesses, that has benefited people creating social capital like creators, and that further aids to creation of economic activity, right? So that acts as a measure of trust for businesses and people, and that has created that has contributed to creation of it's a consumer surplus, which has benefited consumers in economic transactions.
Right. I think it's a pretty comprehensive view of the economic opportunities that DCNs present. But the other sort of angle that you guys have looked at in the paper is, of course, the societal bit of it. So, Prateek, do you want to take us to that?
Yeah, this was a tricky one, right? Because it was harder to find a lot of the things weren't really quantified. So when you're looking at something as wide ranging as, societal level impact of the usage of DCN, there wasn't really a way to quantify it. That being said, and aside for our listeners, if you know of ways, if you have ideas, reach out to us. We're happy to talk and improve on the way we've approached it. And there's also the fact that, look, there isn't a lot of computational social science-based research, specifically in India. So we had to do this more qualitatively, right? Now, in order to do that, society being such a complex collection of, various interacting entities, we first had to figure out a way to abstract this. Right? So we used a visualization of society that Daniel Torto and Christian Fuchs proposed in a book called Social Media, Politics, and the State. This is better understood with the diagram in the document, but let me try and paint the picture. Right. So it basically says that this society is made of a certain number of overlapping subsystems. So you think of first your overlapping state and economic sphere, right? You put them on top, and they're sort of side by side, and they're intersecting with each other. At the bottom, not intersecting with these, is a cultural sphere, right? And in the middle, interacting with all three of these is a civil sphere that's then that's overlapping with all three. Right now, I don't know how good a job I've done of explaining that. So read the document. This is better explained. But the idea with those three types of movements, which struggles for different ends by various actors who belong to different roles. I'll give you a few examples. Right. So for example, so if you have the socio-political system, which is so it defined as a struggle for recognition of collective identity by making demands on the state. Right? So your examples of this people in socio-political roles could include various activists or advocates for causes like privacy, feminism, LGBTQIA rights, anti-discrimination, etc. Then you have the socio-economic movement, which is essentially they've defined as the struggle for the production and distribution of material resources created and distributed in the economic system. Right. And now you can think of this again as for the actors, you can think of people who are advocating for causes like labor or worker rights, consumer protection, and things like that. Right. And then there's the socio-cultural, which is essentially talking about shared interests or practices in the way that people organize their private life. And in addition to this, you also have, like I said, there is a state sphere, economic sphere. So you have political actors like citizens, politicians, bureaucrats, etc. You have economic actors like entrepreneurs, consumers, employees of firms, managers, freelancers, etc. And then you also have private actors, like family, friends, users, your romantic partners, etc. But like I said, look, this is an abstraction, right? In reality, people won't divide along these roles so neatly. Like you will have overlaps across them. So keep that in mind, right? As you're reading this. The other thing that they did was so they used this. So then they used the idea of a triple C framework uh, to explain that DCNs can enable actors to form tasks of creation, which is the first C that comes in there is cognition. Then you can share them with others who will respond. So the second C comes in that is communication. And then these are modified in an integrated manner. That's where the third C comes in, which is cooperation. And all of this occurs in the same social space, which for this context, you can think of, the capability that DCN operators have built and the networks and how they interact across them, right? So using this triple C framework, we try to then identify 5 kinds of actions. Or note that these are not mutually exclusive, right? They do overlap, right? And the first of these is essentially information consumption and production. Second is interaction. Third is identity formation and expression. Then there's organization, and there's enabling financial transactions. So, and then in using examples, then we try to identify or try to provide examples of where this has happened, where, etc. Right? There's a whole lot to go into. We won't be able to cover it in the podcast. And again, it gives you a reason to go and read the paper, how we've done it. But that's the idea. And that's what we try to do with the society aspect of it.
Right. I think if you do listen to the podcast or generally have skimmed through, at 2x speed, read the paper anyway, because I think there's good value in reading that. And Prateek and Sapni have done excellent research. With that, guys, do you have any final thoughts?
I just want to add one thing, right? I think now in doing this, we weren't able to, I think, capture some of the psychosocial elements of that, right? Which is something, a point that we made even in the first paper when we spoke about the harm, right? And I think that remains something that needs to be explored. It just that there isn't a lot of supporting research, specifically in the Indian context, to go about that. So we're keeping an eye out for that sort of research, and hopefully we'll be able to update our understanding of benefit as and when more research is available on that front. Yeah, and essentially the idea of doing this was to sort of it's called a discussion document, right? And we want to create that discussion, get people to to start thinking about this aspect as well, as we were talking about, being able to in making the trade-offs, you need to be able to articulate both the benefit as well as the harm. And I'm sure there will be several people who might have disagreement with what we've written, and that's fine. We want feedback. We want to hear what people think, how we can improve this, because ultimately this is a process where fine-tuning our understanding of harms and benefits towards the longer term strategy of what India should do to govern digital communication networks and the effects that they have.
Great, thank you. Sapni, do you have anything to add?
I think something I've mentioned earlier, and I think we are at the risk of reiterating that. So we've done episodes on how probably Australia and even the UK, etc., are thinking about regulating DCNs from this perspective of harms and benefits. So at this juncture, and as we have mentioned in other podcasts, that that sort of regulatory overflow in thought happens, and at this point, I think it is the right time in our space to think about this. And as Prateek mentioned, so while we are fine tuning this necessary aspect of understanding the benefit harm paradigm, and that it's not a clear dichotomy, is I think that's what we're trying to do with this discussion document. And we'd be really happy to hear from our listeners and other stakeholders and to improve our understanding of how DCNs essentially operate before we think about hard and fast rules for regulation.
Right, thanks guys. Pleasure always recording with you. Look forward to seeing all of you listeners at the next episode of All Things Policy. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market, and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Dugirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
If you're a cricket fan, check out Edges and Sledges, India's favorite cricket podcast.
The podcast focuses on Indian cricket, the IPL, and has a ton of banter both on and off the field.
We talk about the week's biggest cricket stories with current and ex-international cricketers, coaches, or sometimes just between us.
And it's hosted by me, DJ.
Me, Varun.
And me, Ashwin.
New episodes release every week.
You can catch us on the IVM Podcast's website, app,
or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast.